And with that, I would like to switch to English. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce to you Glenn Greenwald.
Thank you.
Glenn Greenwald, as you probably all know, is a former blogger, a former lawyer, a former columnist with the English newspaper The Guardian, and most likely the best-known journalist in the world at the moment. The man who first published the NSA stories, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and numerous other awards in journalism, and author of the book No Place to Hide, which just appeared in German under the title Die globale Überwachung. And just in case you didn't notice on your way in, there are copies of that book for sale in the foyer afterwards. So welcome, Glenn. Very good to have you in Berlin.
Great to be here. Thanks.
We will chat at great length about your book later, if you don't mind. But if you don't mind, let us start by talking a little bit about the man who is behind all the leaks, your source, the whistleblower Edward Snowden. I understand that you have just met Edward Snowden in Moscow 3 days ago.
That's
on
true.
Thursday.
Right.
Is he in good spirits at the moment? I mean, he looks incredibly pale whenever he appears on television.
Well, I think he's just pale in general. That's more a byproduct of his complexion than his mood. But, you know, the thing that was most remarkable to me about having just visited him in Moscow, and it's the first time that I've seen him since a year ago, is that the Edward Snowden that I just met 4 days ago is the same exact Edward Snowden as the one that I met a year ago in Hong Kong, which is extraordinary in itself, given the amount of pressure that he's been under, the amount of attacks that have been launched on him, the fact that his life has essentially unraveled as a result of this act of conscience. And yet what I talk about in the book and what I've talked about a lot is that the thing that most amazed me and influenced me and inspired me about being with Edward Snowden in Hong Kong was this extraordinary sense of tranquility that he had about everything that he had done. I mean, I remember very well being with my journalistic partner, Laura Poitras, in Hong Kong, who's actually here today as well. And we were neurotic the entire time. I much more than her. She at least got some sleep. I almost got none. And yet every single night, at 10:30, at exactly the same time, Edward Snowden would announce that he was retiring for the evening to go to sleep. And we wouldn't see him until 8 hours later, when he would emerge very well rested, despite the knowledge that he was about to become the most wanted fugitive in the world by the world's most powerful government. And what was so powerful about it was that he just had this contentedness and peace from knowing that he had done the right thing and taken meaningful action in defense of his principles. And this same peace and tranquility is very much evident in him today. I mean, you can almost see it palpably. And, you know, I think the reason he's doing so well is that when we were in Hong Kong, our assumption, certainly mine, was that he was going to spend the rest of his life in a cage in the American penal state for what he had done. That's what made what he did so brave, was that he was willing to endure that. And so the fact that he's not in a cage by itself is a pretty good thing. And to the contrary, he's actually completely free to participate in the debate that he helped to galvanize around the world, and that's very gratifying and very fulfilling to him. And you know, the thing that I think is most significant is that he gets to put his head on his pillow every single night with the knowledge that he sacrificed his own interest in pursuit of the values that he believes in and to protect other people's rights. And that's something that very few people in the world get to say, and it brings an incredible amount of fulfillment and happiness to someone when they've done that.
Oh, sure. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about his life in exile. What's he doing all day? I mean, is he allowed to see people? Is he free to go move around the city as he wishes?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you know, is interesting is he looks a little bit different than he did in that famous video, which is what the world remembers most about him. And so he did say that he's actually very free to walk around Moscow. He does a very good job of blending in. He sort of looks like, he almost looks like this kind of like 18-year-old kid from Iowa whose parents have just sent him on this like exchange program, very nervously sending him away to a foreign country for the first time, but knowing that he is now an adult and it needs to go. So he doesn't look like what he is, which is, one of the most significant whistleblowers of the last generation. He blends in well. He has freedom of movement. And he, has always been a child of the internet. I mean, he has spent a huge amount of time prior to the world knowing him as Edward Snowden online. And he spends a lot of his time following the debate that he helped to trigger. He gives interviews, he does appearances, he writes op-eds. He has become an important voice on all of these questions. Is he
working on new projects? Any kind of new projects that you know
Well, I
of?
mean, it's funny, he's so, every time that we talk about doing something or he gets an opportunity that we think would be helpful or constructive for him to do, he always says the problem is I'm just so extraordinarily busy. He works day and night, just being at the center of this swirling controversy. So he has an enormous amount to do that is really quite constructive.
Will he stay for the rest of his life in Moscow?
Well, I don't know. That depends in part on what the people of the country that we're currently sitting in decide to do. It depends on the outcome of debates that are taking place in other countries as well, such as the country in which I live, Brazil, which is seriously debating whether or not he should receive asylum. It is kind of extraordinary. One of the most extraordinary parts of this story to me is to watch all of these countries that have benefited so substantially from the sacrifice that Edward Snowden made. The sacrifice that he made ended up protecting the privacy rights of tens of millions of German citizens and the highest, most powerful politicians in Germany. And so to watch these countries completely unwilling to take even a small amount of risk to do for him what he did for them, which is to sacrifice in defense of their rights, has been really kind of, I think, shameful. And hopefully there is this ongoing debate that's starting to recognize that it's not just the moral, but the legal duty of these governments to do what Russia has done, and that is to protect him from persecution at home. But I think that whether they do or they don't, there's a good indication from the Russians that they'll extend his temporary asylum for at least a year. They've been public about that. So I think he's at least safe and secure for the time being from American persecution.
The German parliament, the Bundestag, would like to hear Edward Snowden's testimony, but not in Berlin, but in Moscow, maybe in the Swiss embassy or something like that, via satellite, or at least that's the intention of the majority parties in the Bundestag. Did you talk about those plans with Edward Snowden when you were in Moscow?
We've talked about that issue prior to my going to Moscow. I think if you're an investigator actually conducting a serious investigation as opposed to trying to placate public anger by pretending that you're doing an investigation, the first thing that you would want to do is speak with one of your most important witnesses in person. Not through the intermediary of the internet or a video screen, because every investigator knows that in-person conversations are much more revealing and much more valuable than mediated ones. Of course, the real conflict there is not about whether he can be on video or whether he should be in person. The real question is, well, the real issue is just how remarkably candid German politicians are about openly proving how subservient they are to the United States and how fearful they are of doing anything that might offend the American government. I am always amazed by that. You would just think, just for the sake of individual dignity, that somebody who's the leader of a large and important country would not be so eager to have everybody know that the choices that the government is making are dictated by this foreign country as opposed to what's good for the citizens of that country. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And so then the question is, I don't speak for Edward Snowden at all, and I don't know what his posture is. But if I were Edward Snowden, what you essentially have here is the German government going to him after he's already done so much for the people of this country and its government and saying, we want even more from you now. We want you to answer our questions, to give us information, to aid us in our investigation, even as we continue to be unwilling to do anything for you. And I don't know how he'll react, but if I were him, I would certainly be at least reluctant to continuously provide benefits and value and assistance and aid to a government that's willing to stand by while I'm threatened with life in prison by my own government.
Is there any chance that Snowden will return to the US and stand trial there?
Well, I mean, he has, indicated that he would like to do that. The problem is and it's really interesting because if you listen to American media discussions about that question, it has this really weird kind of almost sexist bravado. Like the kind of cliche that they've all adopted is that he should man up and come back to the United States. And if he really believes that he did the right thing, he should go before a jury of his peers and argue that and let them decide. The problem is an obvious one, but it's one that they conceal when they say that, which is that the way that the law has been structured and the way that judges have accepted it is that when you're accused of espionage and violations of the Espionage Act, which is the law under which he's been charged, you're actually barred by law, even from raising the defense that the information that you disclosed is information that ought to have been known to the public, that you did the right thing. So the rules of the game are skewed in advance to basically let the government cheat and ensure that they win and that they can convict him. It's not a fair trial. And Daniel Ellsberg, the famous Pentagon Papers leaker, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in July of last year arguing that Edward Snowden did the right thing because the American because the American judicial system, especially in the wake of 9/11, but even before that, has been structured so as to ensure that anybody accused of violating secrecy or endangering national security has almost a certainty of going to prison. And so I think if it were a fair trial, if he could really come back with the confidence that this justice system worked, I think he would strongly consider it. He wants to come back, and he said so. But until that happens, I think it would be irrational for him to do that. Why would he go and just meekly submit himself to one of the most oppressive penal systems in the Western world when there's really no justification for doing so?
And on the other hand, the whole world would be watching if he would return. That wouldn't change the way the Americans would handle that trial?
I mean, it's a nice thought that the Americans are constrained by world opinion, but this is the same government that continues to keep people in cages for over a decade without a trial at Guantanamo, even though the whole world is disgusted by that, and that continues to go around the world, ending the lives of innocent children through Hellfire missiles shot by drones, even though 75% of world opinion is vehemently against that, or that invaded and destroyed a country of 26 million people in Iraq. So I don't think the American government is particularly constrained by the fact that world opinion finds what they're doing to be disturbing. I wouldn't count on that, at least.
There have been news reports lately that Snowden's US lawyers are trying to broker a deal with the federal authorities. Is there any truth to that, to your knowledge?
I mean, it's an exaggerated story. I mean, any defendant who's charged with felonies has their lawyer negotiate with the government. And this has gone back to the last year when Snowden's lawyers, including the ones at the ACLU and private lawyers, have been trying to discuss a reasonable condition or reasonable set of conditions under which he could return in a way that would protect his legal rights and provide some just means of resolving the conflict. But what is, I think, important to understand is that if you look at how the United States government under President Obama has treated whistleblowers, it is more aggressive and more vindictive than any administration in American history. I mean, everybody across the political spectrum recognizes this. And the reason for that is that the way in which the United States government now functions, it is such a sprawling system that relies upon digital and electronic means of storing information. There is no way to prevent leakers and whistleblowers from coming forward with information other than by creating this intense climate of fear where the message is sent that if you do that, we will completely destroy your life. It's just a means of intimidation and bullying and deterrence. And so they cannot let Edward Snowden come back to the United States to a sort of hero's welcome or a slap on the wrist, even though he deserves a hero's welcome because that will embolden other people to come forward when they discover wrongdoing that's being conducted in secret, and that's the greatest fear of the American government.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the book. You write that you almost missed the NSA story. That's almost famous, probably the story of your life, because you basically ignored Snowden's first emails. Tell us that story.
Right. Well, you know, I know it's so easy for people to say, and believe me, I hear it every day. God, Glenn Greenwald is such an idiot, the most important source.
I didn't say that.
No, you haven't. You were too generous to say it and too polite, but you were thinking it. But other people, you know, have said that. And I completely understand that, right? The most important source in a long time, or certainly one of them, is emailing him continuously, almost begging me to take his documents, and I just keep sort of ignoring him. You know, the reality is that at the time, he was extremely afraid, for reasons that turned out to be completely understandable, to tell me anything about who he was or what he had. He was really extremely vague about it. And as all journalists know, you get emails every single day from people saying that they have some huge, groundbreaking story for you, and it usually turns out to be that their boss at work is using the chemicals that come out of airplanes to control their thoughts and kill their houseplants and that sort of thing. So you can't just drop whatever you're doing the minute somebody pops up in your email inbox claiming to have something important, but unwilling to tell you what it is. But I think the more interesting and more substantial point of the story is that we talk a lot about how this ubiquitous surveillance is a danger to privacy, and we talk some about how it's a danger to democracy, the idea that this extraordinarily consequential system was constructed without even the basic contours of it being known to the people of that country. How do you have a democracy in which those kinds of things are kept from people? But there's also a serious threat that surveillance poses to other basic rights, like the right to a free press. How do you practice journalism in a world in which sources on whom journalists rely to tell stories and to report facts are petrified of approaching journalists because of the knowledge that the government is collecting the lists of everybody who communicates with everybody else? It makes journalism almost impossible to do. It makes a free press just this sort of illusory promise. And the way in which Edward Snowden was so incapable of communicating anything to me that would make me take him seriously in an unencrypted environment, I think underscores the danger that poses.
Absolutely. How did you make sure that Snowden just wasn't a lunatic or a government agent trying to ruin your reputation, or a foreign spy?
Yeah, I mean, when I remember that first conversation that I ever had about Edward Snowden with Laura in New York, and we talked about all of those possibilities, that it could be an entrapment, it could be an attempt to feed us false information that we would then publish and have our credibility undermined. The US Army in 2008 actually created a document targeting WikiLeaks and declaring WikiLeaks an enemy of the state, and talked about using those kinds of tactics as a means to destroy WikiLeaks' credibility, to feed them false documents, to entrap them into illegal conduct. So we were cognizant of those things. Or, of course, the idea that this person was mentally unstable or was otherwise unreliable in a way that would make the story lack credibility. And we both felt, I think, from the start that the way he was expressing himself and the things that he was saying was evidence that he was authentic and what he was holding himself out to be. But it wasn't really, I think, until we got to Moscow and we were able to to Hong Kong, and we were able to sit him down in front of us and question him in person, which gets back to what I was saying earlier about how serious investigators would want to speak to somebody in person. It really wasn't until then, when I sat him down, sitting 3 feet away from me in a hotel room, and just bombarded him. I interrogated him for almost 6 straight hours without even letting him go to the bathroom or have a glass of water, because I knew that his credibility was so crucial to allowing us to do the reporting in the right way. And at the end of that day, I didn't have an iota of doubt at all, not a shred of hesitation or concern that he was exactly who he said he was, doing what he did for exactly the reasons that he said.
When did you first realize that this would be a huge, life-changing story for you as well, and a potentially dangerous one too?
Well, when I first started talking to Edward Snowden, his insistence from the beginning was that I travel to Hong Kong, which always raised a lot of questions. Laura and I remember we thought that we were going to be going to Northern Virginia or Maryland, which is where people who have access to top secret U.S. documents live. So the idea that he was in Hong Kong was a huge mystery, and so I said to him, before I get on a plane and travel all the way across the world, I want you to give me some evidence that you're real. Send me some documents. And he sent me probably 24 documents. And I knew at the time...
For a start.
Yeah, I remember him saying, this is a tiny little appetizer for what's coming. And these documents were extraordinary. And, you know, there had never been a leak from the NSA of documents before, and these weren't just top secret NSA documents, they were the documents about the PRISM program and other training manuals showing the vast scope of information that even low-level NSA analysts can access. And so I knew it was a huge story, but it wasn't until I was on the plane when I was traveling from New York to Hong Kong that I was able for the first time to see the full archive, or at least a part of the full archive that he had given to Laura previously, and she let me look at her copy, and I planned to sleep on the plane, and I quickly realized that would never happen, and I spent 16 hours looking through thousands of the most extraordinary documents I had ever seen, and that was really the point when I realized that this story would be like any other. And I also knew that we were going to, it wasn't just the documents, but I knew that we were going to end up reporting the story in a way that would be extremely controversial as well, and that would create an entire debate, not just about surveillance and government secrecy, but about the role of journalism vis-a-vis people who wield great political power, and that all of these debates and all of these controversies that would continue to grow as we disclose more documents would certainly have a huge impact on the world, would change the lives of everybody involved, and had a very significant impact on everything that I was going to do as a journalist and for me personally, and spent a good amount of time thinking about that before doing it.
Where's your backpack? Tell the people about the backpack.
You guys are obsessed with this backpack.
Yeah, absolutely.
You came to Brazil and saw it. Well, you know, one of the huge challenges in doing a story like this is that you're in possession of all of these documents. And these are documents that essentially every intelligence agency in the world would like to get their hands on, including the US government, which still to this day has no idea what Edward Snowden took or what he gave us, which is a pretty interesting fact considering that their primary defense when they justify what they're doing is they say, yes, we're collecting this huge amount of data about what it is you're doing, but you need not worry because this is a very tightly controlled system with extremely rigorous controls. And here was somebody who was downloading their most sensitive documents right under their noses for months, and they had no idea that he was doing it, and still to this day have no idea what he took. So you can decide...
They need to collect more data, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you can decide for yourself whether that sounds like a system that you trust to hold your data. But you know, one of the things that he had done is he had been trained, highly trained, in how to safeguard very sensitive digital information. He was a very highly trained operative by the NSA in how to protect information like this, which obviously is kind of ironic given what ended up happening, but you know, he was able to instruct us on how to safeguard this information as well, which is why we've not ever lost control of a single document, unlike the NSA and the GCHQ, which did lose control of their documents through very sloppy and reckless behavior. We've actually kept very tight control, and that was because of the system that he wanted us to follow. And one of the things he wanted us to do, or told me to do specifically, was to always have with me a full set of the archive physically on me, even though I had safeguarded it in other places, so that if those other places had the information removed, I would still have a full set. And so I took that very seriously, maybe more seriously than he expected, and I had a backpack that was really permanently attached to my back, in which I, at all times for many months, carried with me the entire set of documents. And you know, it produced some strange experiences. I remember being in a grocery store once, and I was sort of looking at produce, and there was a woman next to me studying apples, and all of a sudden it occurred to me that I just so happened to have in my backpack many tens of thousands of extremely sensitive surveillance documents. But the way in which the material was maintained was very heavily encrypted. It was safeguarded to ensure that even if someone did get access to the physical thumb drives, that not even the best intelligence services in the world would be able to crack the encryption. And so security was a very, very important part of what we've always focused on in how we've reported on these materials.
In your book, you write that Snowden told you, and I quote, to use your journalistic judgment to only publish those documents that the public should see and that can be revealed without harm to any innocent people, end of quote. That is a monumental responsibility for you. Which were the criteria for those decisions you took?
Yeah, I mean, that is, you're right, a very significant burden. And I would say that that's by far been the hardest part of doing this story. We have been criticized a lot from, for lack of a better term, the right, by which I sort of mean like the Democratic Party in the United States. Just sort of like the entire national security apparatus of the West and its various defenders and apologists for being really reckless and for helping the terrorists and for disclosing all kinds of information that endangers people's national security, just the same sort of script that always gets read from whenever these kinds of disclosures are made, whenever transparency is brought to people who wield political power. That's the same accusations that get made. There is, though, this other critique that comes from, for want of a better term, the left, that is actually much more serious and much more substantive, though it gets nowhere near the amount of attention that the sort of cliched you're helping the terrorist critique gets, which is that actually we haven't released enough documents, that we've been too slow, that we've been excessively cautious, that we withheld information that ought to be public. That's a debate I take much more seriously. I think that critique has validity to it. I do think, if anything, we've erred on the side of caution, excessive caution, in how thus far we've released the documents, in part because a document that isn't yet released can always be released later, but a document that is released can't be withdrawn. But a very significant part of this debate that often is overlooked is that we did have a source, and do have a source, who had very strong ideas about how this information should and should not be reported. And at the very least, I think he made a tactical judgment that the best and easiest way for the NSA and its Western partners to distract attention from the substance of the disclosures, which is what he was insistent be the focal point of the story, would be to find one, even just one disclosure that we made that they could argue would result in harm to somebody or endangered somebody or would otherwise be a debatable disclosure. And he was very insistent that we be extremely careful, that there were whole categories of information that he did not think should be published. And we talked about this framework in Hong Kong before he gave us the material, and we agreed to it. And I feel honored bound and duty bound as a journalist, but also as a human being, to adhere to that, even if I think there is a reasonable debate to be had about whether that is always the best way. I do think it turned out to be the best way for doing this story. I think the reason there's such a sustained debate around the world, and the reason why these disclosures have been taken so seriously, is because we have been able to keep the focus on the substance of the spying and not questions about whether the terrorists are helped or whether this person over here has been endangered. And that has been a really important part of how we've been driven to make the choices that we make about what should and shouldn't get published.
Is Edward Snowden in possession of more documents that you haven't seen?
I only know what he gave me. And he has been very clear about the fact that prior to leaving Hong Kong, he destroyed his ability to access documents because he was concerned that traveling the world, there would be a danger that other governments would try and compel or coerce him to give them access to those, and that the only way that he could ensure that didn't happen was by preventing him from having ongoing access to the documents. And he's very clear about the fact that he gave the materials to the journalists in Hong Kong and then eliminated his ability to continue to access documents.
Okay, in your book you quote a lot of new documents, and we could talk about them for hours, but there are two that struck me as especially interesting. One is a slide for a top secret slideshow in 2011, which describes the ultimate goal of the NSA operations, and I find it difficult to quote it with a straight face. The document says the NSA should, quote, sniff it all, know it all, collect it all, process it all, exploit it all, partner it all, end of quote. You made that up, didn't you?
I mean, if I were going to make up a document to demonstrate what I think people need to understand, it would probably not be as good as that one. I'm not actually that creative. I mean, the NSA was very generous in creating all sorts of documents that shed amazing light on what they really do. And you know, I think there's an irony to it, which is one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to make a long, comprehensive argument about why privacy is so critical to individual freedom, and to answer this kind of cliche that if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide, that privacy doesn't really matter. And there are a lot of arguments to it, but one of the arguments is that it's only in the private realm when we think that nobody is watching what it is that we're doing or judging what it is that we're doing, that we express our true selves, that we can explore what it means to be a free individual. We can experiment with creativity and dissent and different ways of expressing ourselves that other people might judge critically or harshly, and that when there is an observant eye on what it is that you're doing, or when you think there might be, our behavior becomes much more conformist, much more inclined to do that which other people expect us to do, and the range of options that we have as individuals diminishes greatly in a world in which we think we're being watched. That's the reason why people in power love surveillance, because it keeps people who are subject to it compliant and conformist and in line. And privacy is really this indispensable realm where we can show what we really are. And one of the best examples of that is what the NSA says about itself when they thought nobody was watching. They showed their true face in the form of these documents that we're lucky enough to have. You know, in public, what the NSA will say, and I just debated the former NSA chief Michael Hayden in Toronto a month ago, and this is what he was doing, it's what they all do. They present this very reasonable, modest, constrained version of themselves, which is, we are this very careful, targeted system that's only interested in monitoring the communications of the bad people, of the terrorists, and so you need not worry. And yet when they're in private and they talk about what it is that they're doing and what their objective actually is, they say exactly the opposite. They show their true face. They say that, quote, our new collection posture, which is the title of that slide that you just referenced, is to collect it all, not collect some or most, or collect the communications of the terrorists, but collect it all, process it all, sniff it all, exploit it all, know it all. That really is the institutional mandate of the NSA. And so when we're having this debate and you have the NSA on one side making claims and Edward Snowden on the other side making claims, you can actually dispense with the need to figure out who you trust more or where you're going to put your faith. You can look at the dispositive evidence, which is what the NSA itself said when they thought nobody was watching, and it's very, very clear what it is that they're doing.
The other document sounds a lot less upbeat from the agency's perspective. It says, and I quote again, the collection is outpacing our ability to ingest, process, and store to the norms to which we have accustomed, end of quote. Does that mean the NSA is collecting far more data than they are able to analyze at this point?
Not just to analyze, but to store, which is an amazing fact if you think about it, because we are now at the point where enormous amounts of data can be stored on tiny little thumb drives. And one of the only obstacles that the NSA and the GCHQ, which is its British counterpart, is facing in their goal to create this collect it all system, they're actually increasingly able to collect everything. Their real challenge now is how do you keep that amount of data for as long as you want to keep it so that you can then analyze it and read it and monitor it and use it and exploit it. And it's one of the reasons why the NSA is building this sprawling new facility in Bluffdale, Utah, the primary purpose of which is to have them have the capacity to not only collect, but then to store and to keep all of the information, essentially the entire internet communications that are taking place every day. I mean, some of the documents in the book just show the sheer numbers. They're collecting billions, that's with a B, of emails and telephone calls from around the world from the American telecommunications system every single day. And they're constantly working harder to be able to store it for longer periods of time. And so when you are doing that, it is actually a challenge about how do you keep it. And those documents show our biggest problem now is where do we keep it all? And they're working very hard to find solutions to that.
One of the most controversial points in your book is probably your analysis with why the NSA is doing what the agency is doing. Not to prevent a terrorist attack, but to control the US citizens, the enemies and the allies of the US, to ultimately to protect the power of the US elite. That might sound a little bit like a conspiracy theory, doesn't it?
It might sound like that to people who are completely unfamiliar with the most basic principles of how power is exercised. But I mean, if you look back, it's not only U.S. political culture, it's how power factions always function. Their first mandate is to ask themselves how they can fortify their own power and then how they can increase it. I don't think that's speculative or radical. It's just a basic fact of how human beings use power. And, I think that if you look at a lot of documents that have become publicly available, one of the true concerns that the American economic and political elite has is that there is this growing and extreme economic inequality that is already causing serious social instability, even in previously stable Western democracies. Riots in London or in Madrid or in Greece. There were movements in the United States for the first time in a long time that were seriously rambunctious and disruptive, one from the right, which was the Tea Party movement, the other from the left, which were the Occupy movement. They both got pacified, they both got controlled and co-opted, but the original impetus was the serious anger over not particular politicians, but a fundamental injustice, a fundamental corruption in how the American political system was functioning. And so there is a concern that instability can continue to happen, and almost certainly will, as income inequality and economic inequality continue to grow. And so then the question becomes, what is it that you do about that? And there are really just two options. You can either placate the anger by making concessions to it, and doing serious reforms, and that is definitely not something they're interested in doing. Or you can think about how to protect yourself from it, how to increase your own power, and how to prevent it, and then if necessary, crush it. And surveillance has always been used as a means to pacify and control populations. This country knows that better than any other. The more you know about a population and what the citizens of that population are thinking and doing and planning, especially when you yourself, the people in power, are building an ever higher wall of secrecy behind which they function, there is this extreme information imbalance, so that people in power know everything about the citizenry, and the citizenry knows nothing about what the people in power are doing. A healthy functioning government or political system would be exactly the reverse. The citizenry would know almost everything about what people in power are doing. People in power would know virtually nothing about what private individuals are doing. We've completely reversed that. And when you reverse that, it fortifies the power that the people who control the levers of the surveillance machine are able to have. And I don't think it takes much theorizing to recognize. I don't think it's the only motive, but I certainly think it's a principal one.
And you're saying it's completely irrelevant who is in power, who's the president? The system goes on. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I know that there was this sort of like fever in 2008 that swept Western Europe, and I think Germany was the principal victim of believing that this extraordinary, once-in-a-millennial leader had descended upon the world to bless us with all kinds of fundamental goodness. But there's this amazing document that, if you haven't read, I really encourage you to do so. It's online. It was in the summer of 2008. And the CIA wrote this document in a top secret setting. And it ultimately got leaked, I believe, in 2009, and then WikiLeaks published it, and you can go and read it. And the impetus for this CIA memo was serious concern that anti-war sentiment was spreading throughout Western Europe. There was a government, I believe the Dutch government, that had just fallen as a result of their support for the war in Afghanistan. And the CIA was petrified that as anti-war sentiment continued to spread, that governments around Western Europe would start to withdraw their support for the war in Afghanistan and the war on terror more broadly, leaving the United States to bear the burden alone. And what the CIA analysis said was that the best hope for stemming the tide of anti-war sentiment, the best asset to put a stop to it, would be the election of then Senator Barack Obama. Because it would instantly transform America's militarism and replace this kind of olden, craggy, swaggering cowboy unilateralist face of George Bush, which Western Europe had come to find repellent, with a much prettier, more pleasant, more sophisticated, more educated, coastal, progressive elite face of Barack Obama, and that instantly this war would become Obama's war, and huge numbers of Western Europeans would instantly convert from anti-war activists into people who tolerated the war or even supported it. And I think that that turned out to be very prescient, not just about Western Europe, but about the United States, and not just about anti-war policies, but American imperialism and militarism and aggression generally. The CIA saw Obama as what he was, which was a very valuable branding asset to sell the policies of the United States even better. And you know, the best evidence of that is every year the advertising industry gets together. It's sort of like an Academy Award for advertising executives. And their highest award is Best Branding Campaign of the Year. This is like the best movie award for them. And in 2008, that award was given to the Obama campaign. I mean, like, they actually won the award. They got a plaque, you know, like Best Branding Campaign of 2008, because they recognized that campaign for exactly what it was. And I think one of the benefits of this story has been that it has caused huge numbers of people around the world to reevaluate the role that the United States plays in the world generally, and specifically how they view President Obama, or the actual role that the American president really plays in setting policy.
In your book, you argue that the NSA leaks already have been more consequential than you yourself would ever have imagined in the beginning. What are the most important changes in your perspective?
There are, you know, the kinds of statutory changes that I think people often look to. So, you know, I think one of the things that I've noticed as I've gone around first the United States and now Europe is there's a little bit of the sentiment that, well, look, the NSA still exists and it's still spying, so what really has changed? You know, and I think it's really important to realize how change happens. The US national security state is probably the single most powerful faction in the world. And the building and the walls of the NSA are not going to collapse on itself overnight because you publish a few of their documents and make some people around the world angry at them. That's an unrealistic expectation. And I also don't think that it is realistic to expect that the limitations that can come to American power or the power of the US government are going to be imposed by the US government itself. That too is not, I think, how power functions. People who wield power don't typically look for ways to think about how to limit their own power. You know, there are some legislative changes because there is a lot of anger about this among Americans. There was just a bill passed by the House a few days ago, actually.
But that is merely symbolic, isn't that?
It is, but I mean, I think that symbolism is important in that it is the first time since September 11th that the US government has taken a step backward to restrict its own power rather than a step forward to acquire more power in the name of counterterrorism. And I think it's significant because it reveals that there has been this serious change in how Americans think about these issues as a result of the story that needs to be placated. So it's an important symbol, and I agree that, as I said, is not where change is going to come from. I think there are other important pressure points, such as other countries around the world banding together to think about ways to undermine the American ability to have hegemony over the internet. I think American tech companies are genuinely petrified of the impact that this surveillance will have on their future business prospects. The idea that German companies or Brazilian companies or Asian companies are telling 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 16-year-olds, don't give your data to Facebook and Google and Yahoo because they'll share it with the NSA, give it to us instead, is now become a genuine fear. Who would buy an American tech product knowing the cooperation that they are either forced to give or eagerly give to the NSA? And the US government doesn't listen to the ordinary American citizen and the anger that they experience, but they do listen to Silicon Valley billionaires who are genuinely now interested in some meaningful limits just out of self-interest. But then I think the most important change that has come from this story is just the change in public consciousness around the world. I mean, there has been a sustained debate now for a year in dozens of countries on multiple continents of the planet. And the interest level in this story is higher than ever. I think people are thinking for the first time about a wide range of issues differently, including surveillance and the value of privacy in the digital age and the danger of vesting governments with power that they can exercise in secret, the role of the US, the proper role of journalism vis-a-vis state power. But I also think that it's critical that people around the world recognize the extent to which our privacy is now being compromised on the internet, which in turn is driving people to understand the need for them to take steps themselves to protect their own communications from invasion, which means more and more people using encryption technologies that actually work, or things like the Tor browser that let you perform activities on the internet and remain undetected. And the more the tech world recognizes the need for these products, the more user-friendly they'll become. And I think we're headed toward a world in the near future where encryption will be not something that is used by a bunch of hackers and tech experts and geeks and some reporters and human rights activists, but becomes the default means of how people communicate. And the more we as individuals build brick walls around our own communications, the harder it will be for the NSA and other governments around the world to turn the internet into this massive, unlimited spying regime.
Let's have a quick look. Who is encrypting email in the audience? Will you raise your hands, please? Well, that's Berlin. I mean.
But let me just ask, so just if you could put your hands up, the people who are now encrypting your emails. How many of you, of the people who have your hands raised, were encrypting your emails prior to June of last year when these revelations began? So you have, a good number of people who were, but then a good number of people who began doing it only within the last year. And I think, that is, and I hope it will be, one of the most enduring changes from these revelations.
In your book, you have written a long chapter about why privacy matters for the individual and also for a democratic society. And yet, I personally know so many people who still tend to say, come on, what's the big deal? I have nothing to hide. Let them read my emails. What would be your response to those people?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that there are always going to be some group of people in a population that is indifferent to abuses of power. You could go to the worst tyrannies in the world. You could go to Mubarak's Egypt. Not every Egyptian was in the street marching for democratic reform. Some people were content to just leave politics to the tyrants and go about their lives. There's always a bargain that is offered to citizens by anybody who wields political power, including the worst oppressors, which is, if you remain unthreatening and harmless, if you pose no meaningful challenge to what it is that we're doing with our power, no matter how abusive we get, we will leave you alone. We won't harm you. We won't bother you. And there will always be a certain sector of the population that, for whatever reason, accepts that arrangement. And so there will always be people who say, I don't worry about privacy invasion because I am such an obedient, compliant, passive citizen that I don't actually feel threatened by what they're going to do to me because I've accepted their bargain, that I don't challenge them and therefore they leave me alone, which is fine. That's just probably an inevitability. I mean, I think if tomorrow there was a military coup in the United States or a dictator who suddenly declared himself president for life of Germany, there would be lots of people who would say, this doesn't really bother me. I think the stability that we're going to have might actually be a good thing, and I'm okay with that. I don't feel threatened. So that's always fine. But I think that, the people who make the claim that they don't actually care about privacy really don't believe what they're saying. There's not actually honesty or authenticity to their claim. And one way that you can know that is that these same people put passwords on their email and their social media accounts. And they put locks on their bedroom and bathroom doors. And they take all kinds of steps to keep everybody else out of certain realms in their life, because they too understand that one of the instinctive needs that we have as human beings, one of the attributes that compose what human nature is a desire to have a place where we can go and think and be and do without other people watching. And you know, every single time I have heard somebody say that over the last year, every single time someone has said to me, I don't really feel like I'm doing anything wrong, so I have nothing to hide. I have always said to them, and it's a very serious offer, here's my email account. Please email to me the passwords to your email and social media accounts so that I can just read through everything that you're saying and doing, and whenever the mood strikes me, I can just go ahead and publish it online under your name. And not one person has taken me up on that offer. Not one. So if any of you are people who think that, you know, my email address is glengreenwald@theintercept.com. So if any of you are believers in this idea that, well, if I do nothing wrong, I have nothing to hide, please send me those passwords, and I'll get back to my hotel and we'll start trolling through your emails, and we can see if you actually really believe that. So I think that's one of the reasons the story has resonated, because even though privacy is a difficult value to express and defend, I think our need for it and the way we value it is intuitive, and it's universal to all human beings.
So we have about 20 or 25 minutes left. If you have any question to ask to Mr. Greenwald, this would be the time to do so. We have microphones going around there. Maybe we start with that gentleman there in the red shirt in the back. Maybe you can identify yourself.
Or remain anonymous if you'd like.
Okay, my name is Lutz Brechelt, and I'm still looking for somebody who can explain this to me. Can you explain the following mentality? When Arab terrorists managed to kill 3,000 people by planes once in 200 years, this gives ground to justify almost anything. When Americans managed to kill 3,000 Americans by guns once every 10 weeks, that appears not to be of particular interest. Why is that so?
You know, I think that to really answer that question, you would have to put America on a couch in a psychoanalyst's office and really delve into the way the American mind works in a way that I don't have time to do and probably don't have the capacity to do, and on some level not even the willingness to delve that deeply into those pathologies. But the threat of foreign attack has always been a very potent fear that has been easily exploitable by political leaders. And you can go back to the political theorists of the Enlightenment who talked about the way in which these rights that were starting to be conceived would find their greatest threat in leaders who would effectively exploit threats of danger that comes from outside of the borders. And there's probably a lot of reasons that this is true, in part because human beings are tribal, and so we tend to think that dangers that come from what we're told to think of as other tribes are more threatening than ones that come from within. I think a big part of it is just basic ethnocentricity and racism, that it's easier to demonize people who are from different races and who look differently and have different religions than it is to demonize people who look a lot more like us, which tend to be the people in America who do these shootings. And then there's just the question of the interests that come from playing up each fear. The idea of exploiting and exaggerating the fear of terrorism has resulted in massive amounts of profit and power to the very factions that wield the greatest power already in the United States. So there's a very serious interest in having them and the media outlets that they control exploit those fears. And those same interests aren't served by playing up the concern over domestic violence through guns. And so I think you always have to look at the interests that are served. The last thing I would say is I think it's important not to underestimate the psychological component that came from having 3,000 people die all at once, and also having these massive buildings that were the symbols of American financial might collapse on themselves in a way that was really psychologically traumatizing, in a way that having 12 people randomly slaughtered by some person with a gun doesn't really achieve. And that psychological trauma was very effectively exploited by the American government and huge numbers of private corporations to usher in policies that they benefited from. So I think it's a really complicated question, but I think those are just some of the reasons why there's different reactions to each of those.
There's a question over here. There are tons of questions everywhere. This gentleman in the...
Hello, Mr. Greenwald. My name is Derek Scally. I'm an Irish journalist. Thank you very much for your work over the last year. My question is about European data privacy. As you know, Facebook and other tech companies have their European or even international headquarters in Dublin and in Ireland. Under EU law, that makes the Irish Data Protection Authority responsible for the privacy rights of 500 million Europeans and for policing whether or not these companies are passing on information to the NSA via PRISM. What's your message to the Irish government, the Irish data protection authorities, which may feel trapped between their obligations, their data protection obligations to 500 million Europeans and their interest in not rocking the corporate boat with Facebook, Google, and the US government? Thank you.
I mean, is it actually difficult to weigh the obligations to protect the privacy rights of 500 million people versus the minimal corporate interest of a handful of large corporations that are collaborators with the NSA? I mean, that weighting process seems really easy to me. You know, I'm not really sure exactly how I would approach the question. To really describe the question is in a sense to answer it. But you know, I think you do get at an important point, which is that these companies have become so incredibly powerful in terms of their size and their capitalization, but more importantly, just their centrality to how the world communicates with itself, that I do think we have a situation where even elected governments are almost no match for these corporations. And that poses a very serious problem for pretty much every political question, including how do you have something that resembles a democracy where there are the most influential economic factions that really aren't subject to democratic control. It is inconceivable to think about the Irish government or the EU or certainly the American government imposing meaningful constraints on companies like Facebook and Google. I mean, it's almost impossible to conceive of. And I think that's a really extraordinary problem. And ultimately, the question will be, will people around the world continue to use companies and services that they know are violating their privacy in a really fundamental way? That, to me, seems like the much more promising means of limiting these companies' behavior than hoping that some politician sitting in a capital somewhere will issue some regulations or pass some laws that will do that.
We will really try to answer all questions. Maybe go back in the back there, back. Way back, yeah, okay.
Thank you, Glenn, for your work. I really like the part of your story that by meeting Edward Snowden in person, you were able to trust the story. And so I wanted to ask this question: do you think we've gotten ourselves into the cybernetic regime because we put so much reliance on technological communications? And even if the NSA weren't in the picture, would we still be having some severe problems with technological communications?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm particularly always thrilled when I get a question that I haven't been asked 5 dozen times in the last 4 days, and so thank you for that as well. To actually, I mean, it's a hard question to think about. You know, I think you're right that there are some really profound sociological consequences for human beings to rely on technological means to interact with one another, and I doubt that we're even at the kind of early stages of understanding what all those changes are going to be, because there's psychological changes, there are sociological changes, there are political changes. There are changes pretty much on every level that comes from this brand new way of how we interact with the world. But I also think that the internet, the reason why so many people have found such great promise to it, and that I also, look at as something that has enormous positive potential, which is what makes defending it from these intrusions so imperative, is that it really is a remarkable tool of liberalization and emancipation and democratization. I mean, not just in the obvious way that it lets human beings band together and to engage in activism in ways that were previously unimaginable against the most powerful factions. And you see all sorts of things that had previously been probably impossible now working as a result of this technology and how it enables human beings to communicate with one another. But I think even the opportunity to explore the world in ways that are completely inaccessible in the absence of this technology on a personal level, on a level that ensures personal growth and exploration, is probably its most important component. And one of the things that happened when I was in Hong Kong and I was talking to Edward Snowden, and it was on the first day, and the overarching question for me, once I realized that he was who he said he was and that these documents were genuine, was what would lead somebody who was 29 years old and who had a stable career and a lucrative paycheck and a girlfriend who loved him and a family who supported him and his entire life ahead of him, what would actually lead somebody like that to be willing to unravel it all and give it all up in defense of what seemed to be these abstract political principles? And even, what didn't make sense to me is even when he told me that he was so moved by the value of privacy, that really didn't make much sense to me, because he was somebody who actually knows how to protect his own privacy, even if a lot of other people don't. And so what he said to me was that unlike a lot of people who are older, who grew up without the internet, when he was a child growing up in a lower middle class family without much opportunity to travel the world or see exotic things, had this fairly conventional, stifling, suburban upbringing, the internet was this gateway to an entire new world of not just speaking to people who he would never otherwise have met, but being exposed to ideas that he would never have known about, to being able to experiment with different identities, with different thoughts, with different ideas, that it is this means that allow us as human beings to just explore the world and ourselves in completely unimaginable ways prior to the internet, and that he could not live for the rest of his life having it sit on his conscience that he could have done something to protect that and failed to do so. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if you look at the response to the Snowden story and the NSA revelations, the reaction really doesn't break down like most political controversies do along standard partisan lines. We've had at least as much support in America from conservatives and Republicans and the right as we have from liberals and Democrats and the left. That's really not a predictable metric for knowing how somebody will react. The much more reliable way for knowing how somebody reacts to this story is age. Younger people tend to be overwhelmingly supportive of Snowden, while older people tend to be a bit more wary. And the reason is, obviously with lots of exceptions, that younger people who grew up with the internet not as this instrument that you use for discrete tasks like making a hotel reservation or buying a book or getting an email, but as this critical venue for how we explore who we are as people, are much more angry and much more concerned about the danger of having the government turn that kind of intimate venue into the greatest means of human control and coercion and surveillance ever known. And so I think that's the reason why it's broken down. And there are some limitations to interacting with people technologically, but overall, I think the internet has been extraordinarily valuable on the whole, politically, personally, culturally, and pretty much in every way. And that's why I've devoted myself to this cause of keeping it free of political and social coercion and control.
There's this lady over there who's...
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Mike Duda. I think it's pretty clear that Edward Snowden could wake up someday in the back of a C-130 with a black bag over his head, but your husband was detained and interrogated over many, many hours at Heathrow, and I believe I remember you expressing personal concern. I was surprised to see you on Colbert again, and there were no metal detectors at the door here. In what way do you think that that original impression of threatened repression, of people aiding and abetting whistleblowers, how do you think that's going to play out in the future, and how do you view that personally now, since you seem to have freedom of movement? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, the American government deliberately created an environment in which we would be in fear of what would happen if we traveled internationally or returned to the United States. You had the most senior members of the Obama administration, including the most senior national security official, James Clapper, repeatedly in public calling us criminals, calling us accomplices of Edward Snowden, Keith Alexander accusing us of selling documents around the world, which is the nature of espionage for which lots of people are sitting in prison for many decades. You had the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee urging the FBI director to regard me as a criminal and to arrest me and prosecute me. Of course, my partner was detained, and there's an ongoing criminal investigation in the UK. And so even though we were finally able to return and took the risk of returning without much happening, without any action being taken, which I think was the byproduct of the visibility of this story, which really protected us in a lot of ways, what they wanted to happen was that in the back of our minds, every single time we would publish a new document, they wanted us to think, if I cross this next line, if I publish this next document that they're telling me I shouldn't publish, will that be what makes the difference between my being able to return home safely and my being able to return home and being greeted by FBI agents who will arrest me? It was a climate of fear that they thought was helpful to deterring the journalism. And I think what's really important is that it isn't just aimed at the specific journalist in this story. I remember turning on CNN by accident. I never turned on CNN on purpose, but I turned it on by accident once. I was flipping through some channels, and they had like one of those traditional debates that cable television has. They had like 4 people convened at a table, and they were debating, and the graphic on the screen was, should Glenn Greenwald be prosecuted? And they were just having a nice little debate, like you debate tax policy or, whether America should start the next war. It was, should Glenn Greenwald be prosecuted? And what this does is it mainstreams the idea that journalists and other people who help whistleblowers can actually be put in metal handcuffs and be brought to a cage and be prosecuted. You can deter the journalism process by doing what Egypt does and actually arresting large numbers of journalists. But you don't have to do that. You can also do it by making this threat of prosecution constantly hover in the air and making it be a real possibility. There are still people who have been involved in the Snowden story, including Sarah Harrison, who lives in Berlin, who is still quite reasonably fearful of returning home to the UK because of what would happen to her because of the very courageous help that she gave to Snowden. And there are other people who have been done reporting in the story who are still being advised not to return to the US. So whether or not anything ultimately happens, the mere fact that these threats were constantly made has a very deliberate and a very effective means of deterring future journalism and deterring future whistleblowers as well.
Okay, I'd like to bring a couple of female voices into the discussion. There's one. No.
I have the impression that now at the social media forums, there's a controversy about people. Some just leave and they don't give their opinions anymore into our modern agora, or how you will call it, and some still do it. And I feel it is very generous of some people who really have an opinion, who is valuable to be heard. And what do you think? How would you recommend to behave? Because this also is one of the main weapons for resistance, for informations. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, that's a really important question that gets to one of the core points, I think, of this story, which is that, I remember when the first time that I ever wrote about WikiLeaks was, I think, in like January of 2010. And it was a time when almost nobody had heard of WikiLeaks. It was before they had done their Iraq and Afghanistan leaks. And the way that I learned of WikiLeaks was that in 2008, the US Army, as I mentioned before, had written a report declaring WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state. And it talked about ways to destroy WikiLeaks. And ironically enough, that report got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it. And I read about it in the New York Times. There was this small little article, and it said the US Army had declared this weird little group led by a strange Australian hacker to be an enemy of the state because they thought that he posed some sort of danger to information security. And I remember reading the article. I didn't know much about WikiLeaks, but I thought, okay, well, any group that has been declared to be an enemy of the state by the US Army is one that merits a lot of attention and probably a lot of support. So I went and I did research, and I interviewed Julian Assange, and I published the article online. And at the end of the article, I encouraged my readers to donate money to WikiLeaks because they were sitting on documents and didn't have the staff to process them. And I gave a link to PayPal and to other electronic means that they could donate. And in response, every time I would write about this topic or go to public events like this, I had all kinds of people, American citizens, saying to me, you know, I agree with what it is that you're saying about WikiLeaks. I completely understand the value that they have. The problem is that I'm unwilling to donate money to them because I'm afraid that if I do, I will end up on a government list somewhere, or that eventually, if they're declared a terrorist group, I could actually be prosecuted for materially supporting a terrorist organization. And that was a really profound experience for me because I was watching huge numbers of American citizens voluntarily giving up their own political rights, the right of free speech, of free association, because they were petrified of what the US government would do to them if they exercised those rights. And you can have all the rights in the world written down on this piece of paper or piece of parchment and call it the Constitution. But if you have a US government or any government that shows that it is willing to cross all those lines and punish anybody who challenges or deters them, then those rights become completely meaningless. And so the question of, you know, how do we continue to encourage people to engage in political activism and dissent in a world in which governments can know everything that we're doing and saying is a really critical one. I think one of the reasons why I wanted to write a book about Edward Snowden and what he did, as well as the surveillance state, and why I've spent so much time talking about it, is because I think that when we see acts of courage, they become contagious. I think, you know, Edward Snowden didn't just do what he did in a vacuum. He was inspired by people like Daniel Ellsberg, you know, 50 years ago, and Chelsea Manning 2 years before him, who took similar steps. And those acts inspired Snowden. I think Snowden's doing what he did. I know it inspired me. I think it inspired the journalists with whom I worked on the story and people around the world. And I think that courage will continue to be contagious. And then on top of that, it's up to, you know, young people who have skills in computer programming and technology not to get lured into going to work for Palantir and other huge technology companies that work with the CIA and the NSA, or to go to work for the NSA, but go to work for groups that are creating tools to protect ourselves from that kind of invasion so that people can continue to engage in the internet and social media without those kind of worries. But you're right, that is one of the central questions, is how can you have these basic rights in a world in which governments can surveil and take all sorts of actions to punish people who oppose them.
Guess we have time for 2 more questions. Those 2. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jens Dombe, and I have a question. In your introductory statement, you said that you met Edward Snowden 4 days ago in Moscow. Now today, Der Spiegel published on their website an excerpt of an interview with Wolfgang Kalek, which is the German lawyer of Edward Snowden, saying that Edward Snowden's US lawyers are negotiating with the US administration for a safe return of Edward Snowden to the US. And there's a quotation that says, everybody involved in this story is aware that a solution in harmony with the US administration would make most sense for Edward Snowden. So my question is, what is your opinion about this? Would it make sense for Snowden to return to the US? Would it really be the best solution? And if he would do so, then what would that mean? Would the revelations then stop, or would you still continue releasing the documents?
We talked about that a little bit already. Maybe you can have a short answer.
Yeah, I mean, just as far as the last part, I mean, there is no event that could possibly happen that would make me stop publishing the documents that he gave me. All of the newsworthy documents in that archive that should be published are going to be published, and we're thinking now and working on ways to expedite that process to make it more global in scope. So the reporting will continue no matter what. As far as his returning to the US, I mean, that's a very personal judgment that he has to make. I think he's always been very clear about the fact that if he could live in one country, he would choose the United States so that he could go home to be with his family and his friends and the country that he thinks he took steps to defend. But that option doesn't exist for him now, and I have a hard time seeing it actually existing for him because I don't think the US government would ever allow him to return without spending serious amounts of time in prison, and I would hope and I expect that he would not do that.
Final question.
That's probably me. I received a microphone. My name is Murat.
Go ahead.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Murat Suner, and I'm wondering what would need to happen that the apathy of the politicians and decision makers in the world could be broken to show a different reaction to what we learned about all the global scope of the surveillance right now. When I think of, for instance, of what the effect of Fukushima was on the nuclear power policy in the world and the reaction of the German politics on that. So could you think of any event or anything that should happen that there would be a sort of a turnaround as a reaction to what we know about surveillance?
Well, I mean, you know, one of the, I think, most revealing parts of this story has been that in both Germany and Brazil, the first story that was published was about mass indiscriminate spying on the private communications of hundreds of millions of citizens. And both the German and the Brazilian governments issued some pro forma cursory statement pretending to be upset, but really didn't care at all. And it wasn't actually until the stories were revealed that both the president of Brazil and the chancellor of Germany were included in the people who were being targeted for surveillance did they suddenly become genuinely angry, which I think reveals a lot about their priorities and how they view the world and who governments actually exist to serve. And for that reason, I mean, when I think about how surveillance abuses can be curbed and how privacy can be reestablished on the internet, I really don't think all that much about how to change the minds of political leaders, who typically are people who have made so many compromises on their way to ascending to that level of political power, that all the vibrancy and passion and principle and soul that they may or may not have been long ago suffocated. And so I really don't expect that that's where curbs on power are going to come from. I think they're going to come from a lot of other different places, principally beginning with individuals who band together and start to find ways to demand protections to their own privacy, not by hoping that leaders will generously bestow these protections or limit their own power, but through a variety of other means that actually coerce and compel those kind of changes. And I think that there have been very substantial and very profound shifts in how people around the world, numbering in the hundreds of millions, think about all of these issues. And once consciousness begins to shift on profound questions, I think radical change is the inevitable byproduct. It doesn't happen overnight. It won't happen in ways that you can completely predict and map out, but I do think it's absolutely inevitable. And that's why, you know, I think that, and I've talked to Edward Snowden about this many times, that if you look at what our expectations were back in Hong Kong for what we hope to achieve by doing these revelations and compare it to what has actually happened, what has actually happened wildly exceeds what we were hoping to achieve even in our best case scenario. And so, you know, for that reason, I mean, I know I'm gratified by the way the story has played out, and I know he is as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Greenwald, thank you so much for your time, for your work. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you in Berlin. Now you have to do some really serious book signing to do in the foyer.
Yeah. Thank you to Zeit as well for sponsoring this event, the ones in Hamburg and Munich as well. I've really enjoyed them.
Thank you so much. Meine Damen und Herren, auch Ihnen vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Vielen Dank, dass Sie diesen Vormittag mit uns verbracht haben. Obwohl draußen die Sonne so herrlich scheint, ich hoffe, das tut sie immer noch. Ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Restsonntag und für alle, die es noch nicht getan haben, heute können Sie wählen gehen, tun Sie es. Es ist eine Lust zu wählen. Vielen Dank.